What if I told you that the numbers you learned in school, the hospitals you trust with your life, the coffee you drink in the morning, and even some of the ideas behind your constitution were shaped, directly or indirectly, by a civilization most Americans barely studied in depth? Not in a conspiracy theory way, not in a hidden secret history way, but in a very real, documented, academic way. Tonight, we're not talking about religion as belief. We're talking about civilization, power, knowledge, trade, ideas, and how a society that rose from the deserts of Arabia went on to influence the modern world, including the United States, in ways that still echo around you every single day. To understand that influence, we have to go back to a time when the world looked very different. In the 7th century, much of the known world was dominated by two exhausted superpowers, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Persian Sasanian Empire in the east. They had just fought decades of brutal war against each other. Economies were drained, armies were thin, cities were battered. And in the middle of all that, on the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious and social movement emerged. Within a single generation, that movement unified tribes that had been divided for centuries. Within decades, it expanded beyond Arabia. Within a century, it stretched from Spain in the west to India in the east. But expansion alone doesn't change world history. Ideas do. As this new civilization spread, it didn't just conquer land, it absorbed knowledge. Greek philosophy, Persian administration, Indian mathematics. It translated, debated, improved, and redistributed that knowledge across continents. Fast forward a few centuries. While much of Europe was struggling through what historians often call the early Middle Ages, cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus were centers of scholarship, trade, medicine, astronomy, and engineering. And this is where the story starts connecting to you. Let's talk about numbers. The numbers you use every day, 0 through 9, are commonly called Arabic numerals. They didn't originate in Arabia, they came from India, but it was Muslim scholars who adopted them, refined their use, and spread them across the Islamic world and eventually into Europe. Why does that matter? Because Roman numerals couldn't handle advanced mathematics efficiently. Try doing algebra or complex accounting with Roman numerals. It's nearly impossible. With the spread of what we now call Arabic numerals, calculation became easier, trade became more sophisticated, engineering became more precise, science accelerated. One scholar in particular, working in 9th century Baghdad, wrote a book that would change mathematics forever. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. His book on mathematical calculation introduced systematic solutions to equations. The word algebra comes from the title of his work. Even the word algorithm, a word that now powers your phone, your apps, your social media feed, comes from a Latinized version of his name. Algorithms. Think about that for a second. The systems that determine what you see online, what ads are shown to you, how search engines rank information, all trace their conceptual roots back to a mathematical tradition that flourished in the Islamic Golden Age. But math wasn't the only field transformed. Medicine saw a revolution. In cities like Baghdad and Cairo, hospitals were not just places for treatment, they were teaching institutions. They had separate wards, they kept patient records, they had pharmacies. One physician, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, a medical encyclopedia so comprehensive that it became a standard textbook in European universities for centuries. Imagine that. For hundreds of years, European medical students were studying from books written in the Islamic world. The transmission of that knowledge didn't happen by accident. It happened through translation movements, trade routes, and cultural contact, especially in places like Islamic Spain. In cities like Cordoba during the 10th century, you had paved streets, public lighting, libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes, and scholars of different faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, working side by side. Now here, where the American connection begins to sharpen. Europe didn't develop in isolation. When European scholars encountered the intellectual output of the Islamic world, especially through Spain and Sicily, they translated those works into Latin. That knowledge then flowed into European universities. That intellectual revival helped spark what we now call the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, in turn, helped lay the intellectual foundations for the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment deeply influenced the political philosophy behind the United States. John Locke, Montesquieu, scientific rationalism, empirical thinking. These ideas didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were part of a long chain of knowledge transmission that crossed languages, cultures, and religions. If you're finding this fascinating so far, take a second to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people who are curious about history. And if you want to catch the next parts of this story before anyone else, make sure you're subscribed. The next parts are all organized in the playlist on my channel, so you can follow the full journey from start to finish. Now let's go deeper. Trade. The Islamic world sat at the crossroads of continents, connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia. Muslim merchants traveled across the Indian Ocean, through Central Asia, into West Africa, and across the Mediterranean. They weren't just carrying spices and silk. They were carrying ideas. Paper-making technology, originally from China, spread westward through the Islamic world. Paper was cheaper than parchment. That meant books became more accessible. Knowledge became easier to copy and distribute. By the time papermaking reached Europe, it fueled an explosion in literacy and scholarship. Then there's navigation. Muslim astronomers made significant improvements in star charts, celestial calculations, and instruments like the astrolabe. These tools were essential for navigation. When European explorers later set out across the Atlantic and around Africa, they relied on navigational knowledge that had been refined over centuries, much of it preserved and enhanced in the Islamic world. So when we talk about the age of exploration, we're not just talking about brave sailors and new continents. We are talking about a global inheritance of scientific knowledge. Now think about architecture. Look at the arches in some of the oldest American buildings, the courtyards, the geometric patterns, the emphasis on symmetry. Islamic architecture developed advanced forms of the arch and dome, along with intricate geometric designs based on mathematical precision, through Spain and later through global exchange. Those aesthetics influenced European architecture, which eventually influenced American design. Even the concept of higher education has connections. Institutions like Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco and Al-Azhar in Egypt are among the oldest continuously operating educational institutions in the world. Structured curricula, endowed chairs, academic debate traditions, these models shaped how knowledge was organized and transmitted. European universities developed within a broader world where these models already existed. And universities, as you know, became central to American society. Let's pause for a moment and reflect. This isn't about saying one civilization owns modernity. It's about recognizing that history is interconnected. Civilizations borrow, they adapt, they build on what came before. When we look at America today, a nation built on immigration, diversity, and layered influences, it makes sense that its intellectual DNA would also be layered. But here's something even more interesting. Some of America's founding fathers were aware of Islamic civilization in ways that might surprise you. Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of the Quran, not as a religious conversion, but as part of his broader study of law and governance. He was interested in understanding different legal systems and religious traditions. The early United States signed treaties with Muslim-majority nations in North Africa. These were among the first international agreements the young republic made. Why? Because trade mattered. Global connection mattered. Understanding other civilizations mattered. And that's really the heart of this entire story. The Islamic world wasn't isolated from the West. It was part of a continuous exchange. Coffee, for example. Coffee culture in America is massive, but coffee consumption spread widely through the Ottoman Empire before reaching Europe. Coffee houses in cities like Istanbul became centers of conversation, politics, and intellectual exchange. When coffee reached Europe and later America, it transformed social habits. Some historians even argue that coffee houses played a role in shaping Enlightenment debate, replacing alcohol with a drink that sharpened the mind. Imagine that ripple effect. A drink cultivated and popularized in Muslim lands, becoming part of the intellectual culture that shaped Western political thought. History isn't a straight line, it's a web. And we've only just begun to untangle it. In the next part, we're going to move from knowledge and trade into law, governance, and social systems. We'll explore how certain legal ideas, financial tools, and even concepts of tolerance and pluralism evolved, and how echoes of those systems can still be found in modern democracies. Because once you start looking closely, you begin to see something powerful. The story of America isn't separate from the story of the wider world. It's connected. And the hidden Islamic influence on modern America isn't hidden because it's secret. It's hidden because we rarely zoom out far enough to see the full picture. This is only the beginning. When we left off, we were standing at a crossroads of ideas. We had seen how mathematics, medicine, trade, architecture, and education traveled from the Islamic world into Europe, and eventually into the intellectual bloodstream of America. But knowledge is only one part of civilization. The real question is this: how did governance work? How were diverse societies managed? How were contracts enforced, trade regulated, and minorities treated? Because if you want to understand influence on modern America, you have to look at law, finance, and political systems. Let's start with something surprisingly modern: contracts. In the early Islamic world, trade wasn't just common, it was foundational. Merchants traveled thousands of miles across deserts and oceans. When you're sending goods across continents, you need trust, you need documentation, you need enforceable agreements. Islamic legal scholars developed detailed contract law covering partnerships, profit sharing, leasing, sales, inheritance, and charitable endowments. One financial model in particular stands out: profit-sharing partnerships. Instead of charging interest, investors could provide capital to merchants in exchange for a percentage of profit. This structure encouraged risk-sharing rather than fixed-interest lending. Centuries later, similar partnership models appeared in Mediterranean trade networks and eventually influenced European commercial practices. Now think about early America, a nation built on commerce, on shipping, on risk-taking entrepreneurs. Joint ventures, shared investment, maritime trade insurance. These ideas didn't appear out of thin air. They evolved over centuries of cross-cultural exchange across the Mediterranean and beyond. Let's zoom in further. During the height of Islamic civilization, courts were accessible to common people. Judges, known as qadis, were expected to operate independently from political rulers when applying the law. While the system was not modern democracy, the concept that rulers were not above the law was deeply embedded in legal theory. That's interesting when you consider the American constitutional principle that no one, not even the president, is above the law. Again, this is not about direct copying. It's about parallel development in a world where ideas circulated. Now consider religious diversity. In major Islamic cities, especially during the early and classical periods, Christians and Jews lived as protected communities under agreements, that allowed them to maintain their religious practices, legal traditions, and internal governance. Was it perfect equality by modern standards? No. But in a medieval world, often defined by persecution and forced conformity, structured pluralism was significant. Fast forward centuries later, the American experiment would be built on religious freedom, on the idea that different faiths could coexist under a single political framework. The founders were deeply aware of European religious wars. They wanted to avoid sectarian chaos. And in studying world civilizations, they encountered examples of multi-religious governance, including in the Ottoman Empire, which at one point governed vast territories with remarkable diversity. Some American thinkers admired aspects of Ottoman tolerance compared to Europe's bloody sectarian conflicts. Now let's talk about banking. Modern finance is complex, but its roots lie in medieval trade systems. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, and sophisticated accounting practices were used widely across the Islamic world. These tools allowed merchants to travel without carrying massive amounts of physical gold or silver. A document issued in one city could be redeemed in another. Safer trade, broader networks, faster expansion. European merchants learned and adapted similar systems. And centuries later, those systems evolved into modern banking structures. Wall Street may feel like a purely Western invention, but its DNA includes financial innovations that traveled across cultures long before America existed. Even language tells the story. Words like tariff, magazine, coffee, sugar, cotton, and alcohol have roots connected to Arabic or trade networks that passed through Islamic lands. Every time you use those words, you're unknowingly echoing centuries of exchange. But influence wasn't just economic or legal. It was intellectual. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, scholars translated works from Greek into Arabic, not just preserving them, but critiquing and expanding them. Aristotle didn't simply survive through Europe alone. His works were studied intensely by Muslim philosophers like Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, whose commentaries later shaped European scholastic thought. When Thomas Aquinas engaged with Aristotelian philosophy, he was interacting with a chain of scholarship that had passed through Muslim thinkers. Again, think about that ripple. Medieval Islamic philosophy influencing Christian scholasticism, which influenced Enlightenment thought, which influenced the intellectual climate of colonial America. History is layered. Now here's something that often surprises American viewers. Some early American political debates referenced Islamic societies as comparative examples. In discussions about religious liberty, the founders sometimes cited how Muslim-majority states allowed Christian minorities to worship, arguing that if even foreign empires could tolerate diversity, then the new republic certainly should. It's a subtle but powerful detail. Islamic civilization was not invisible to early American thinkers. It was part of the global awareness of the time. And here, where it gets even more practical. Agriculture. Techniques for irrigation, crop rotation, and agricultural manuals flourished in the Islamic Golden Age. Crops like citrus fruits, rice, and certain varieties of sugar spread through Islamic trade networks into Europe. Later, these crops became staples in parts of the Americas. So even the food landscape of the United States carries echoes of agricultural diffusion shaped by Islamic-era networks. Take a moment and let that sink in. Numbers, algebra, hospitals, universities, navigation, coffee, finance, law, agriculture. None of these things arrived in America directly from one source. They traveled, they evolved, they blended. And that blending is the real story. If you're enjoying uncovering these unexpected connections, make sure you hit like. It tells the algorithm that thoughtful history content matters. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. The next parts of this story go even deeper, and they're all organized in the playlist so you can watch the full series in order without missing anything. Now let's shift slightly. Influence isn't always positive. History includes conflict too. There were wars between European and Muslim powers. There were crusades. There were sieges and rivalries. But even conflict creates contact. Through war and diplomacy alike, technologies, ideas, and cultural practices moved between worlds. Gunpowder weapon systems, fortification designs, and military organization methods circulated across battle lines. And centuries later, when European empires expanded globally, including into North America, they carried with them knowledge accumulated from centuries of interaction with the Islamic world. You can't separate the threads cleanly. The story of global civilization is woven. By the 18th century, when the American Revolution began, the intellectual environment that shaped the founders had already absorbed influences that passed through Islamic civilization. Scientific method, rational inquiry, global trade networks. Even the idea of a written constitution, while rooted in European traditions, emerged in a world that had seen centuries of written legal codes and administrative sophistication across multiple civilizations. And here's something deeply American about this whole story. The United States itself became home to Muslims very early on. Some enslaved Africans brought to America were Muslim. Their stories are only now being rediscovered and studied more fully. Later waves of immigrants, Arab, South Asian, African, brought Islamic traditions into the American mosaic. So Islamic influence on America isn't just historical and intellectual. It's human. It's part of the population, part of the culture, part of the ongoing story. In the next part, we're going to move from the medieval world into the modern era. We'll look at how 19th and 20th century interactions between the United States and Muslim-majority societies reshaped politics, economics, and global power, and how those relationships continue to shape headlines today. Because influence didn't end in the Middle Ages. It evolved. And understanding that evolution might completely change how you see the modern world. By the time the United States emerged as an independent nation, the age of empires was far from over. But the center of gravity was shifting. For centuries, major Muslim-majority empires like the Ottoman Empire had been dominant regional powers, controlling trade routes, key cities, and strategic waterways. Europe had risen, industrialized, and expanded overseas. Now a new player was entering the global stage, America. At first, the relationship was practical. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, American ships began trading in the Mediterranean. That meant interacting with North African states like Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers. These encounters weren't just commercial, they were diplomatic and sometimes military. The Barbary conflicts became some of the first overseas challenges faced by the young United States. Treaties were signed, naval power was tested, negotiations were conducted across cultural and religious lines. What's important here isn't the conflict itself. It's the fact that from its earliest years, the United States was engaging directly with Muslim-majority governments, not as a distant myth, not as an abstract civilization, but as political realities. Global interaction was built into America's DNA from the beginning. As the 19th century unfolded, the world industrialized rapidly. European empires expanded deeper into Muslim-majority regions, North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. Meanwhile, American missionaries, educators, and traders began establishing schools, hospitals, and institutions in places like Beirut, Istanbul, and Cairo. Some of these institutions still exist today. This created another layer of exchange. American educational models influenced parts of the Muslim world, At the same time, American scholars studying abroad encountered rich intellectual traditions, law, theology, philosophy, that challenged simplistic stereotypes. And then came oil. In the early 20th century, massive oil reserves were discovered in the Middle East. Suddenly, regions that had once been important for trade routes became critical for global energy. American companies and governments became deeply involved. This wasn't just economics. It reshaped geopolitics. Alliances were formed, military bases established, strategic partnerships built. For better or worse, the modern American global presence is intertwined with Muslim-majority regions. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. Cultural exchange didn't stop. Immigration to the United States increased in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Arabs, many of them Christian, some Muslim, arrived in cities like Detroit, New York, and Chicago. Later waves included Muslims from South Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. Mosques were built, communities formed, businesses opened. Today, millions of Muslims live in the United States. They are doctors, engineers, teachers, small business owners, soldiers, athletes, and elected officials. Islam in America isn't foreign anymore. It's local. It's part of the national fabric. And that changes the narrative. Because when we talk about Islamic influence on modern America, we're not just talking about medieval mathematics or Renaissance philosophy. We are talking about neighbors, co-workers, classmates. But influence also works in the other direction. American culture, movies, technology, political ideas has deeply influenced Muslim-majority societies over the past century. Hollywood films are watched in Cairo and Jakarta. Silicon Valley technology shapes communication in Istanbul and Dubai. American universities host thousands of international students from Muslim-majority countries. It's a two-way exchange. And sometimes it's complicated. The 20th and 21st centuries brought wars, interventions, and political upheavals that strained relationships between the US and parts of the Muslim world. Conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, the broader war on terror, political revolutions during the Arab Spring. These events shaped perceptions on both sides. For many Americans, Islam became associated primarily with headlines about conflict. But that's only one chapter of a much longer story. If we zoom out, the relationship between America and the Islamic world spans trade, diplomacy, education, science, immigration, energy, and culture. It's layered, and it's still unfolding. Here's something powerful to consider. After 9/11, there was a surge in interest among Americans to understand Islam more deeply. University courses expanded, books were written, interfaith initiatives grew. Moments of crisis sometimes create moments of curiosity. And curiosity can lead to understanding. If this series is helping you see these connections in a new way, take a second to like the video. It really helps thoughtful conversations reach more people. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the final parts. The entire series is organized in the playlist so you can watch every chapter in order and see the full picture come together. Now let's step back and look at influence in a different way. Technology. Many foundational ideas in mathematics and optics from the Islamic Golden Age eventually contributed to developments in engineering and physics. Ibn al-Haytham, for example, made major contributions to optics and the scientific method, emphasizing experimentation and observation. His approach influenced later European scientists. The scientific method became central to modern science. Modern science became central to industrialization. Industrialization shaped America. Even if the chain is long and indirect, the connections exist. Or consider cartography, mapmaking. Muslim geographers compiled detailed maps of trade routes, coastlines, and regions stretching from West Africa to East Asia. Their works were later accessed and adapted by European explorers. Better maps meant safer voyages. Safer voyages meant global expansion. Global expansion reshaped the Americas. When you hold a modern GPS device in your hand, you're using satellite technology. But the intellectual tradition of measuring, mapping, and calculating the Earth's surface has roots that stretch across civilizations, including Islamic scholarship. Now think about civil rights and pluralism in America. The idea that a nation can contain multiple faiths under one political system was radical in the 18th century. Today, it's normal. Mosques stand alongside churches and synagogues in American cities. Muslim members of Congress take their oaths of office. Muslim entrepreneurs run startups. Muslim athletes represent the country on the global stage. That presence shapes culture, food, fashion, music, language. Halal food trucks in New York. Eid celebrations in public schools. Arabic calligraphy in contemporary art. It's no longer just influence from centuries ago. It's contemporary, living, evolving. But here's the deeper point. Influence doesn't mean domination. It doesn't mean one civilization replacing another. It means exchange. Sometimes peaceful, sometimes tense, but always interconnected. The modern world is not Western alone, not Eastern alone, not Islamic alone. It's a fusion. And America, perhaps more than any other nation, is a fusion of fusions. In the final part of this series, we're going to pull everything together. We'll explore what this interconnected history means for the future, how understanding shared intellectual roots can change public conversations, and why recognizing global influence isn't about rewriting history, it's about completing it. Because once you see the threads clearly, you can't unsee them. And the story of modern America starts looking a lot bigger than you ever imagined. By now, you can probably feel it. This story isn't really about us and them. It's about layers. Layer upon layer of exchange, intellectual, economic, political, cultural, stacked over more than 1,000 years. And when you zoom out far enough, you start to realize something powerful. Modern America didn't rise in isolation. It emerged from a world already shaped by centuries of interconnected civilizations, including the Islamic world. But now we need to ask a deeper question. Why does this matter today? Because in the 21st century, perception often replaces history. Many Americans' understanding of Islam has been shaped primarily by modern geopolitics, news headlines, conflicts, political debates. That's real. Those events matter. But they represent only a very small slice of a very long timeline. If you only look at the last 20 or 30 years, you miss the previous 1,300. And those 1,300 years contain mathematics that built your phone, medical knowledge that shaped your hospitals, trade systems that shaped global capitalism, and philosophical debates that influenced the Enlightenment. Let's look at something concrete: education. Walk into any American university. You'll see departments dedicated to mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, law. The structure of modern academia, faculties, degrees, formal lectures, written examinations, developed over centuries through a combination of European and earlier models. In medieval Islamic cities, scholarly circles gathered in mosques and madrasas. Teachers granted certifications to students who mastered specific texts. Academic chains of transmission were recorded carefully. The culture of structured scholarship was alive and organized. When European universities began forming in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, they did so in a world already influenced by centuries of preserved and expanded classical knowledge. much of which had passed through Muslim scholars. And those European universities eventually became the model for American higher education. So when you attend college in the United States, you're participating in a global intellectual tradition that spans continents and civilizations. Now let's talk about science and curiosity. One of the defining characteristics of early Islamic scholarship was the drive to reconcile faith with reason, to observe the natural world, measure it, test it. Astronomers built observatories, physicians conducted clinical observations, engineers designed water systems and mechanical devices. This spirit of inquiry, test, observe, refine became foundational to modern science. When that scientific mindset spread into Europe and later into colonial America, it fueled innovation. Industrialization, electricity, aviation, computing, and eventually the digital age. You can't draw a straight line and say, this invention came from that civilization alone. But you can trace the intellectual currents, and those currents are global. Now let's bring it into modern American life in a more personal way. Think about cuisine. Pizza in New York uses tomatoes, originally from the Americas, but pizza ovens and certain bread-making techniques were influenced by centuries of Mediterranean exchange. Spices traveled through Islamic trade networks long before reaching European kitchens. Rice cultivation techniques moved across continents. Sugar refining spread through trade routes that linked the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. American food culture, diverse, hybrid, constantly evolving, is a reflection of centuries of global exchange. The same goes for language. Open an English dictionary and you'll find words with Arabic roots scattered throughout. Algebra, algorithm, alchemy, alcohol, tariff, magazine, coffee. These aren't foreign words anymore. They're just English. And that's how influence works. Over time, it becomes invisible because it becomes normal. Now consider something more philosophical, pluralism. The American ideal, at least in theory, is that people of different backgrounds can coexist under a shared constitutional framework. That idea feels modern. But large, multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies have existed before. The Ottoman Empire, for example, governed diverse populations across 3 continents. It allowed religious communities to manage aspects of their own internal affairs through structured systems. Again, not identical to modern democracy, not perfect by modern standards. But examples of managing diversity at scale existed in history. When American thinkers debated how to build a republic that avoided Europe's religious wars, they were looking at global precedents, not just local ones. Understanding that broader context changes the way we see America's founding. It wasn't a small, isolated experiment. It was part of a global conversation about governance. If this series has been expanding your view of history, take a second to like the video. It helps more people discover long-form historical storytelling like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. The final part ties everything together, and it's all organized in the playlist so you can watch the complete story without interruption. Now let's confront something honestly. Influence is not always comfortable. Recognizing that civilizations borrow from each other challenges simplistic narratives of superiority. It forces us to admit that progress is shared, that no single culture owns innovation, that greatness often comes from synthesis. America itself is a synthesis. Indigenous foundations, European political theory, African labor and culture, Asian trade networks, Middle Eastern intellectual contributions. It's all there. And when we reduce history to clashes of civilizations, we lose sight of the centuries of cooperation, translation, borrowing, and adaptation that actually built the modern world. The 21st century is hyper-connected. Your smartphone connects you to Istanbul, Dubai, Jakarta, Cairo in seconds. American companies operate in Muslim-majority countries. Students from those countries study in American universities. American media circulates globally. The exchange hasn't stopped. It's accelerating. But here's the question we need to carry into the final part. If history shows that civilizations grow stronger through exchange, what does that mean for the future? What happens if we lean into shared knowledge instead of division? What changes if Americans begin to see Islamic civilization not as something distant or threatening, but as one of the many threads woven into the fabric of modern life? In the last part, we're going to step beyond the past and into the future. Because understanding history isn't just about knowing what happened. It's about deciding what we do next with that knowledge. If you've stayed with this story from the beginning, you've probably noticed something subtle but powerful. At first, this felt like a historical exploration: dates, scholars, empires, trade routes. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. It became a reminder. A reminder that the modern world is not the product of one civilization, one religion, one continent, or one language. It's a collaboration across centuries. And America, more than almost any other country, is living proof of that collaboration. Let's bring everything together. You use algebra without thinking about where the word came from. You rely on algorithms without realizing the name traces back to a 9th century mathematician. You drink coffee without knowing it became popular through Ottoman trade networks. You attend universities built on institutional models shaped by global scholarship. You live in a country whose founding generation studied world civilizations, including Islamic societies, while forming its political ideas. None of this means America is derived from one source. It means America emerged in a world already connected. And here why that matters for the future. The 21st century is defined by interdependence. Energy markets link Texas to the Gulf. Technology companies in California hire engineers from across the Muslim world. Medical research collaborations span continents. Financial systems operate globally in milliseconds. The same interconnectedness that existed through medieval trade routes now exists through fiber optic cables. The scale has changed. The principle hasn't. Civilizations advance when they exchange. They stagnate when they isolate. If you look honestly at history, you see that the Islamic Golden Age flourished when it translated Greek texts, adopted Indian numerals, and incorporated Persian administrative systems. Europe flourished when it absorbed and expanded upon knowledge preserved and developed in the Islamic world. America flourished when it drew from European Enlightenment thought, global trade systems, diverse immigrant communities, and layered intellectual traditions. Progress has always been cumulative. Now here's the deeper question. What happens when we forget that? When history is reduced to conflict alone, we start seeing the world in blocks: civilization versus civilization, culture versus culture. But when history is viewed as exchange, something changes. You start seeing threads instead of walls. And those threads are everywhere in American life today. Muslim doctors working in American hospitals. Muslim scientists contributing to research labs. Muslim entrepreneurs launching startups. Mosques participating in interfaith coalitions. Young American Muslims growing up fluent in both their faith tradition and American civic culture. This isn't a foreign presence. It's part of the American mosaic. And influence works in both directions. American constitutional principles, civil rights movements, and technological innovations influence societies across the Muslim world today. Students in Cairo study American political science. Entrepreneurs in Dubai build startups inspired by Silicon Valley. Activists across regions reference American civil rights history. The exchange continues. But here, the key difference between the past and the present. We are aware of it now. For the first time in history, you can sit in your living room and learn about civilizations across the globe instantly. You can read original texts, watch lectures, engage in dialogue. Ignorance is no longer inevitable. Understanding is a choice. And that choice shapes the future. If Americans understand that Islamic civilization contributed to mathematics, medicine, navigation, philosophy, architecture, finance, and more, not as an abstract claim but as documented history, then conversations change. Fear loses some of its power. Curiosity grows. Respect becomes easier. And that doesn't mean ignoring real political disagreements or global challenges. It means grounding them in context. Because context creates clarity. The story we've told across these 5 parts isn't about rewriting American history. It's about completing it. When you zoom out, America doesn't look smaller. It looks bigger. Bigger because it's part of a global human story. Bigger because its foundations are connected to multiple civilizations. Bigger because its future depends on cooperation across cultures, not isolation from them. If this series shifted your perspective even slightly, take a moment to like the video. It helps this kind of long-form historical exploration reach more people who are tired of surface-level conversations. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider joining the channel. There are more deep dives coming, and they're organized in playlists so you can explore full stories from beginning to end. Now let's end where we began. What if I told you that the numbers on your screen, the medical systems you trust, the trade networks that power your economy, and even some of the philosophical currents behind your constitution are part of a shared inheritance? Not Eastern, not Western, human. The hidden Islamic influence on modern America isn't hidden because it's secret. It's hidden because it's woven so tightly into the fabric of global history that we stopped noticing the threads. But once you see them, you can't unsee them. And once you understand that progress has always been shared, you start to realize that the future will be shared too.